Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In my last video, you saw me install the cylinder heads at the end of the video. But prior to installing those heads, I recorded the footage that I'm going to show in this video. And I had a very specific purpose for doing it because I wanted to show something that I kind of ran into, and it was something that kind of had me scratching my head. So a little background is I'm an aircraft mechanic by trade. And I've been working on cars since I was a little kid, but as I became an adult, I chose to go into aircraft maintenance, and I've done it for many years now. And in aircraft maintenance, they always tell you to have your maintenance manual with you. What the governing tech data that shows how the job is to be accomplished, whether you're working on the structure of the aircraft, whether you're working on an engine or one of the aircraft systems, you should always have your tech data with you. And so that's something that's been ingrained in me for all these years, and it's hard for me to get away from that, even when I'm working on my car or my truck at home. And so I generally will always have some kind of tech data with me. And usually when I'm working on a vehicle, it takes the form of either a Haynes manual or a Chilton manual. And I've used both kind of interchangeably. I have probably copies of each for the different engines that the different vehicles that I have. But it's just something I do, and it's not that I don't know how to do the job, but once again, like I said, it's kind of been ingrained in me, so I will always go back and kind of read through the installation process or the removal process, get some pointers, get some tips, ideas of what I need to watch out for. And so that's kind of just the way I do things. So when I got ready to install the cam and the timing chain on my engine, of course I went to my manual and I began to read. And so I want to read to you kind of what I had in mind when I went to install this and the problem I ran into. And it was something that when I first looked at it, I was like, this may just be me going overboard, because that's kind of in my nature that a lot of times I'll check and double check and triple check things. But I went on the forums to kind of get other people's opinions, and what I realized is a lot of other people were running into the same issue, and they were kind of questioning it. And so let me read you what the book says. I'll turn the camera around, and then I will show you exactly what I'm talking about. So if you go into the book, it tells you, and this is a Haynes manual, it says that to loosen the camshaft sprocket bolts one turn, then screw the crankshaft balancer bolt into the end of the crankshaft and rotate the crankshaft in the normal direction of rotation until the timing marks align. Verify that the number one piston is at TDC, or top dead center. And so that's where the question comes into play, because if you go back, the book actually defines what they consider top dead center. They say that top dead center is the highest point in the cylinder that each piston reaches as it travels up in the cylinder bore. Each piston reaches TDC on the compression stroke and again on the exhaust stroke. But TDC, and I want you to catch this statement, but TDC generally refers to piston position on the compression stroke. Positioning the piston at TDC is an essential part of many procedures, such as distributor and timing chain sprocket removal, and that would also go for installation. So what we have here is the manual tells us when you're removing or installing the timing set on the engine that you should have the number one piston at top dead center. If you notice, when I read, it didn't specify on what stroke that the piston should be on, whether it should be on the compression stroke or the exhaust stroke. But when we read the general notes, it said basically that it can reach top dead center on either stroke, but generally, and it's saying generally in this manual, when it says to set it at TDC, it's referring to setting it at TDC on the compression stroke. And so when I went in and began to try to figure out which stroke was the compression stroke of the engine, what I soon came to find is that if you set the engine up according to the way the manual shows, that you're actually not setting the number one piston to top dead center on the compression stroke. You're actually setting it up on the exhaust stroke. And so hopefully this video will explain it. It may seem kind of confusing right now, but I think by the end you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. So let's dive in and see if we can learn something. So the problem that I was referring to earlier stems from the question of timing the camshaft to the crankshaft. So in the manual it talks about lining up this divot on the cam gear with that dot on the crankshaft gear, and that should be correct timing for your cylinder number one. So if you notice, number one cylinder is at top dead center. It's at the top of the bore. But before we get into that, let me actually walk you through what we talk about. Most people watching this video probably understand what I'm speaking about, but there might be some people out there that really don't know. So I want to go ahead and grab a wrench and I'll walk you through. So what we speak of when we're talking about stroke is that as you begin to rotate the engine, you will notice that number one cylinder, and I have it marked number one, I'll explain that in just a moment. Number one cylinder begins to move down in the bore. Okay, normally you would have the head installed, and so this would be an enclosed airspace here. So it has reached bottom dead center, and so that would be considered one stroke. Okay, as you continue to rotate the engine, you can see it coming back up in the bore. Okay, and when it reaches top dead center there, that is the second stroke. Continuing on around, going back down toward bottom dead center, that is your third stroke. And finally we come back up on the TDC, and that is top dead center, that's your fourth stroke. So most engines in vehicles today, at least in gasoline engines, are considered four-stroke engines. And that's what that means. So it takes 2 complete revolutions of the crankshaft in order to accomplish those 4 strokes. But if you notice that the gear on the crankshaft is much smaller than the gear on the camshaft. And the reason that is because the fact that the camshaft spins at exactly 1/2 the speed of the crankshaft. So when the crankshaft turns full 2 revolutions, which would be 720 degrees, the camshaft is only turning 360 degrees, or 1 full revolution. And so that becomes very important when considering what I'm about to show you here. So one of the things I wanted to explain first off is that this is the firing order of the LS engine. It's 18726543. So the cylinders are always paired up together. So you would have cylinders 1 and 6 in pairs. You would have cylinders 8 and 5, 7 and 4, and 2 and 3. And what I mean when I say that they're paired up is, if I have my number one cylinder at top dead center of my compression stroke, then number 6, which is the opposing cylinder, is going to be at top dead center, but it would be on the exhaust stroke instead of the compression stroke. But they're always in the same position. As they move, they're going to move together. Okay, and that's just because of the way the crankshaft is built. And so that goes the same with 8 and 5, 7 and 4, and 2 and 3. So what I mean by the stroke then is the intake stroke is we talked about that first we showed on the when I showed the movement of the pistons, that one stroke down. So you would have an intake stroke, you would have a compression stroke, you would have a power stroke, and an exhaust stroke, and those are controlled by the movement of the crankshaft. But what determines whether that particular cylinder is on these different strokes is the movement of the camshaft, because the camshaft is what controls your valve opening events. So I've got a funny little way to remember this, but it actually works for me. So you guys remember the old kid story, the little song is Old McDonald Had a Farm, right? And if we look at the first letter in each of these valve events, so as we see, E stands for the exhaust valve, I stands for the intake valve, O is whether it's open or it's closed. So remember, Old McDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O, okay? And so what that means then is, and we'll go to the close here and the openings here, but exhaust, intake, open, okay? And then what I remember is because on the last part of that nursery rhyme, basically it's I-O, the opening event takes place on your last 2 strokes and then your closing events take place on your first two strokes. So it's EC, IC, EO, IO. Exhaust closed, intake closed, exhaust open, intake open. So let me walk you through exactly how this works. So as any given piston in the engine, and we'll use number one for an example, is coming up in the bore on its exhaust stroke, right before top dead center. So this is top dead center, these are bottom dead center. Right before top dead center of your exhaust stroke, your intake valve is open. Okay, your exhaust valve is already open here. Okay, now right before top dead center, your intake valve is going to open, and then when you get over to the, understand that it continues on this way, but when we get over to the intake stroke, shortly after top dead center of your intake stroke, your exhaust valve is going to close. And so now what you have is you have a cylinder that's in a closed chamber inside your engine, and as that piston begins to move down in its stroke, basically you have exhaust valve closed, your intake is open, and so it's going to begin to draw a suction of the fuel air mixture into your engine. Okay, and as that fuel air mixture is drawn in, it's pulled down and it gets the largest volume possible because the chamber side is growing and growing and growing as the piston moves down. It reaches bottom dead center, and shortly after bottom dead center, the intake valve closes. So now you have exhaust valve closed and intake valve closed. But that piston is going to continue moving, so it begins to move up in the bore, and it begins to compress that fuel air mixture. And the pressure gets higher and higher and higher as that compression takes place. Okay, and so we see right here, I've got an ignition event. And so IGN stands for ignition. So right before top dead center of the compression stroke, that your spark plug would fire and that fuel air mixture is ignited. And there's a rapid expansion of the gases that basically, this happens very, very quickly, but once that ignition event takes place, it begins to force the piston down on the power stroke, and that's why they call it the power stroke. That's where you get the power of your engine. And notice also that this is the longest duration where you have both of your valves closed. It starts at just a few degrees after bottom dead center of your compression stroke, and it lasts almost all the way through to the power stroke. So your exhaust and intake valves are both closed for a very long period of time, almost a full rotation of the crankshaft. And so, like I said, that's where you're getting your compression, you're getting your ignition, and then you're getting the power from your engine. And then just prior to bottom dead center of your power stroke, your exhaust valve opens, and as the piston begins to move up in the bore, you've got your intake valve closed, your exhaust valve opens, and the piston begins to push that spent fuel air mixture out of the exhaust pipe. Okay, so this thing happens extremely quickly. It happens hundreds and even thousands of times a minute. And that's why you get RPM, you get, 2,000, 3,000, 6,000 RPMs, that's rotations per minute. So that crankshaft is moving very, very quickly. And even though the cam is only moving at half the speed of the crank, it's moving very fast also. So you get these ignition events. So anyways, that's basically a general explanation of what's going on. And the reason I wanted to show that, it's very important because I want to show that when our timing marks are lined up on our cam sprocket and on our crank gear, and our number one piston is at top dead center, we're trying to figure out if it's on top dead center of the exhaust stroke or if it's on top dead center of the compression stroke. And most people have discovered that even though the book clearly says that generally speaking, when they're talking about TDC, they're talking about on the compression stroke, we find out that on an LS engine, when you have those marks lined up, that's not TDC of the compression stroke, it's actually TDC of the exhaust stroke. And it's going to be kind of hard for me to show it because just getting the correct camera angle, but I'm going to do my best to try to show exactly what we're talking about here. Alright, so one thing I wanted to explain before we continue is what do we mean when we say cylinders 1 through 8, and how are they determined? So this is the front of the engine, and generally speaking, most of the time, if you have a cylinder, the cylinder that is closest to the front of the engine is always considered number 1. So we would either would have this cylinder here or this cylinder here. So what I want to do is just kind of get a measurement, and I don't know how well that's going to show up on camera, of the front of the block to the front of the piston. And we have about 1.2 inches. If we go over to this opposite side, from the front of the block to the front, I'm sorry, get a better camera angle there. Front of the block to the front of the cylinder is right at 2 inches. So obviously this one over here is closer, and let me see if that shows up a little better with my measuring tape. It may have shown up fine, but it looked pretty blurry to me. So try to do this backwards here. So as you can see, from the front of the block to the front of the piston, just is not quite 1.25 inches, but on this opposite side it is just a little bit over 2 inches. So that's how we get that this is cylinder number 1. And then it's up to the individual manufacturer to determine how they want to number the rest of the cylinders. General Motors typically will number 1, 3, 5, and 7, and then the opposite side will be all evens, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And so remember, I said that earlier that when we would have with the firing order, we have the opposing set of cylinders. So as you can see here, this is cylinder number 1, it's at top dead center. And then cylinder number 6 is at top dead center. So you can see how they're in the same spot. Likewise, if we look at number 8, it's about halfway down in the bore, and it's going to be the same position as cylinder number 5, which is going to be here. Okay, and then number 7 is at bottom dead center pretty much, and it's going to match up with cylinder number 4, which we can see is at bottom dead center. And then cylinders 2 and 3. So there's the cylinder 2 and cylinder 3. So hopefully that explains what I'm talking about, how they work together, but they're on different strokes. So now what I want to do is I want to get this engine spun around, and I want to show you how that we can determine that cylinder number 1 is indeed on the exhaust stroke and not on the compression stroke, with these marks lined up. And once again, we're looking at this dot right here and this indicator here on the timing gear. And it's not perfectly at TDC, so you can see they're off just a little bit. You just need to spin it around just a tad. But you can see there's a little lull when the piston reaches the top before it starts going down. It's exactly in the center, so you'll see that the piston will not start moving, even though, see, I moved it around. Now they're lined up better, and the piston is still at top dead center because it comes up, and before the relative motion begins to pull it back down, there's a little bit of lull at the top of the cylinder. Same thing at the bottom of the cylinder. So that's very normal. But I'm going to spin this engine around so we can kind of get a better view of what we're talking about. I'm going to go one more time, but I'm not going to bring it all the way up to TDC. I'm going to have to get an assistant out here to help me to try to show you exactly what we mean. So you can see that the dot is coming up around, and we're looking for it to get up here to the 12 o'clock position. Give me just a moment, and I'll get an extra pair of hands out here so I can hopefully demonstrate this to you clearly, and I'll be right back. You see that dot right there?
Yeah.
And then this.
Okay.
This is going to turn this way, that's going to turn up. That's going to move up to 12 o'clock.
That's going to... this way?
Yes. Okay, so just try to take it slow. Okay, hang on. All right, so as I explained earlier, guys, there should be no relative movement of your valves right now if number 1 is on the compression stroke. Remember how we showed that that's the longest duration, but that both the intake valve and the exhaust valve are closed. And so we should not see any movement. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the engine all the way up to TDC of the number 1 cylinder. I'm not going to show the piston because I want to show the valves, and it's going to be kind of hard to do. But as we turn, you're going to see these push rods move right before we get to top dead center, and then you're going to see them move right after top dead center. And then we'll go back to our diagram and I'll explain it to you. And then we'll move over to number 6 and we'll do the same thing. So I'm going to have my lovely assistant, who is my daughter, turn the engine for me. Hang on. All right, baby. Go ahead and you guys watch the top of the push rods. You see the push rod in my right hand is moving up. Keep going a little bit. See the top one, the one in my right hand is moving up. And then keep going. Keep going, keep going, keep going. All right. So what we've done is we went through all the way through. You can move that. We went all the way through, went up to top dead center, and you saw the valves moving. And so that should not happen if it was on compression stroke. So what we're going to do is we're going to move it around and we're going to look at cylinder number 6. All right, we're getting there, so I'm going to have to move the camera around, set up on the opposite side. Tripod doesn't want to fit in there like that. So I'm going to move my push rods over to cylinder 6, and all I'm doing is I'm using hand pressure to push the lifters down against the cam. And so once again, I'm going to have my lovely assistant move the engine. I'm just holding hand pressure, and you should see no movement from going through top dead center. All right, go ahead. Keep going a little bit more. All right, thank you very much. And so I hope you guys saw that there was absolutely no movement. Hang on just a second, I'll have you go a little bit more. There was absolutely no movement of the valves. And now we're going to go ahead and bring the piston down through bottom dead center, and right before bottom dead center, we're going to see our exhaust valve open. So, all right, go ahead and finish up. Okay. So you see that the push rod now in my left hand is moving up. That is the exhaust valve. Go a little bit more. All right, and that's it. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so I'll release my assistant to go back to her leisurely date. And anyway, so if you can see, I have this valve or this lifter labeled E, exhaust, because the exhaust valve now open. So, but that is going almost to bottom dead center now of the power stroke. So that's exactly what we want to see. So we saw absolutely no movement on cylinder 6 going from prior to top dead center of the compression stroke all the way through the power stroke. And the reason being is like we showed on our thing, and I'll flip this around. As we showed, there should be no movement until you get the movement we just saw right before you get to the exhaust stroke. So remember, we have exhaust valve closed, intake valve closed, and then through. So I started right before top dead center where your ignition is going to take place, but if we could have gone all the way down here and shown it all the way through. There was no valve movement at all, no lifter movement I should say, and which is going to be translated into the valves through the push rods and the rocker arms. So there was absolutely no movement at all until we got just before bottom dead center of the power stroke, and then we saw our exhaust valve open. So what we can surmise from that is absolutely number 6 cylinder that's on the compression stroke and not number 1 cylinder. And so you might ask, why in the world would they do that? Well, it's actually a pretty simple explanation. Let me move the camera around and I will show you. So, pull my push rods out. So what we're doing here is when we're setting, and I'm going to rotate the engine back around. And I'm just going to get them relatively close there. So when we're setting dot to dot on our crankshaft gear and our camshaft gear to get top dead center, that is absolutely top dead center of the #1 cylinder. But that's top dead center of the #1 cylinder on the exhaust stroke. And the reason being is let me go ahead and spin the engine around and I'll show you. I have to back it up just a little bit, went a little too far. And now I went a little too far that way. So what you can see is now if you look at our crank gear, our dot is at the 12 o'clock position. If you look at our cam gear, our notch is also at the 12 o'clock position. That is top dead center of the #1 cylinder on the compression stroke. But as you can see, it would be much more difficult to align those two dots if you were installing this timing chain to make sure you absolutely got it 100% on, because it's extremely crucial that those dots match up. So you could get it off one tooth or another, and if you're old like me, then your eyes can deceive you and it could be a little bit off. But if you have it turned around to the other position where the notch is at the 6 o'clock position and the crank is at 12, then it's much easier to see, and you can guarantee that you have the timing dead on. Yes, it's on the #6 cylinder, but actually this is top dead center on the compression stroke of the #1 cylinder, where you have your dot here and your notch up there. Okay guys, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the video for the day. I want to say again, thank you very much for joining me. This content was fun for me to make, but I realized that for many people it might be kind of dry. But that's just kind of the way my mind works. When I see something that I don't really completely understand, I've got to work through it. And if there was a critique on the first video from a lot of my friends, they were saying that maybe I wasn't quite technical enough in the video. So like I said, I had already had this video made for the most part. And so I guess it's kind of perfect that it was so technical that maybe it'll kind of balance the two out. But the next video, I'm going to get back to working on the engine. We've got a lot of parts that we need to get in and get assembled on it. That way we can get it back in the truck. So once again, thank you very much for joining me. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.